East Prussia was the first land of Germany the Red Army marched into. On October 16, 1944, the soldiers of the 184th Infantry Division of the Major General Gordovikov first crossed its border. The Sappers, pontooniers, and other military engineering units were also there, shoulder to shoulder with the infantry, gunners, and tank crews. The men and officers of the engineer units helped to storm the enemy positions, paved the roads, deactivated the minefields, spanned the rivers, and built the bridges. The last spring of the war was about to start. The Liberators were approaching Königsberg, where the Corps of Engineers had to play a major role. Vladimir Ryabushko, Alexander Piank, Ivan Zhemkuzhnikov, and others in the Sappers of the Liberators series. The profession of a sapper is one of the most difficult, and one might say it is especially difficult in the military affairs. One day, lay mines on the path of the enemy, and the next day, risking their lives, they deactivate their own and enemy minefields. And a few days later, they span the river anew, right near the destroyed bridge. In East Prussia, there was a great number of water barriers, large and small rivers, streams, and canals. Most of the bridges had been destroyed by the Germans. The sappers had to conduct the engineer reconnaissance of the rivers and, where possible, find fords with the hard bottom and up to 1.2 meters deep. This was the very depth fordable for the T-34 tanks without additional equipment. Vladimir Ryabushko recalls, "We broke the barns, the houses, and the settlements we were going through. We needed logs for bridging, and there was no time to look for timber. A war is always a disaster." If the depth of the river or the nature of the bottom did not allow fording it, it was necessary to quickly improvise a bridge. Usually the bridges were built on piles. The piles were often installed in the old-fashioned way. A rope was tossed over a pulley. A log was fixed at one end of the rope as a drop hammer. A group of men lifted it, holding the other end of the rope, and let it go to ram the pile. Diesel hammers were also used, those captured as trophies or domestic ones. A diesel hammer consists of a guide structure, which is a pipe fixed on the pile, a combustion chamber, and a massive hammer. The sappers installed the diesel hammer on a pile and lifted the hammer. The fuel was injected into the combustion chamber and ignited when the hammer went down, causing it to reciprocate. The piles were installed in spans, which consisted of several rows of piles and served as the basis for the bridging. Alexander Piank recalls, "The most difficult thing was a hammer in the piles. We were in the open areas. There was nowhere to hide. Often the Germans fired at the place of crossing with high explosive shells, and we had nowhere to hide from their splits." However, it was not always possible to build and rebuild bridges in a short time and often in the enemy fire zone. Thus, the heavy equipment was transported to the other bank with the help of the pontoon bridges. The engineer, sapper, and special pontoon battalions were rapidly sent to construct them. The pontoons were floating metal structures which were coupled to one another and which served as the basis for the bridging. Before spanning the river, the engineering units monitored the opposite bank, occupied by the enemy, day and night. They identified the location of the German gun emplacements, the hidden approaches, determined the so-called blind zones, which were reachless for the enemy fire due to the steepness of the banks. In most cases, while the Soviet engineers were building a bridge, the Germans continued to hold their defensive positions on the opposite bank. The preparatory spanning works had to be done covertly, observing the camouflage. As a rule, there were not enough of the pontoons, and bridges were combined of the pontoons, boats, rafts, and other improvised materials. The work began at night. The men constructed ramps on both banks. the places where the bridge was to contact the mainland. The pontoon parts of the bridge were assembled somewhere upstream or downstream. Closer to the night, a motorboat towed the pontoon parts, and then they were linked to the ramps. A few hours later, the bridge was ready. The tanks and artillery could move on, but it could have happened that the enemy soon discovered the river crossing. Ivan Zhemchuzhnikov, the hero of the Soviet Union, the commander of the Engineer Sapper Battalion, recalls. Once the Nazis discovered the river crossing, 3 dozens of junkers brought down their deadly cargo on the Ribbon Bridge. The attack was not over yet, but the soldiers had already jumped out of the dugouts. There was no bridge anymore. Only the smoking logs remained on the bank instead of the trestles that had been towering up there before, and the wreckage of the wooden ferries were seen far away down the river. But the pontooniers knew it from their experience that the pierced pontoons could have not sailed too far, soon after the divers found them. They tied metal wires to the sunken pontoons, and then the tractors came near the river bank and pulled the pontoons up to the shore. Now the pontoons needed only to be repaired, and then they were again assembled in the bridge under the enemy mortars and artillery fire. In autumn 1943, when crossing the Dnieper, the engineering troops applied a novelty: the underwater bridges. The bridges were built so that its runway was 30 to 40 centimeters below the water's surface. It was impossible to locate such a bridge from the air. The sappers had to work directly in the cold water of the Dnieper, but none of these bridges had ever been destroyed by the enemy. By the end of February 1945, the troops of the 3rd Belarusian Front had approached Königsberg. The city was blockaded from the north, east, and south, but there still existed a narrow corridor in the northwest between the German forces defending the city and the forces of the Wehrmacht stationed on the Samland Peninsula. The Königsberg fortification consisted of 2 defensive belts, the external and the internal. The outer defense belt was about 50 kilometers long and was arranged as a network of strong points or resistance nests, Widerstandsnester. Within this belt there were 12 major and 3 additional forts with a system of long-term facilities. Besides, there was an all-round anti-tank ditch filled with water, 6 to 10 meters wide and up to 3 meters deep. The forts were brick constructions shaped as hexagons, about 300 meters long and 180 meters wide. The forts of Königsberg were built in the mid-19th century, but during the war they were reinforced by the German engineers, who had turned the city into a truly impregnable fortress. The walls and structural floors of the fort were made of brick and were up to 1.8 meters thick. All the stone structures were protected with an earthen envelope, 5 to 6 meters thick. All this made the main buildings of the fort almost impervious to the artillery fire. The main defensive element was the system of trenches and communication trenches between the forts and buildings. The anti-tank barriers encircled the city in 2 or 3 solid belts. The length of the anti-tank ditches along the external contour totaled 48 kilometers. Along the internal contour, it was 2.5 kilometers. The front line of the enemy defense was covered with 1 to 2 lines of barbed wire and minefields. The engineer troops had to break through the East Prussian fortifications and ensure the advance of the Red Army. The officers of the engineers' units were trained in the military engineering schools. In addition to the studies of the demolition techniques, mine doctrine, construction of the field facilities, mining and demining, the students received also the general military training to be able to replace the infantry commander if it was necessary during the battle. During the war, the training period ranged from 3 months to 1.5 years and was determined by the situation at the front. In addition to the guys who had just finished school, the best privates from the engineering units were also sent to the military engineering schools, as well as those soldiers from the troops of other kinds who had managed to master the appropriate civilian job, at least a little, before the conscription. The classes were held every day, almost without holidays. The students studied the military mining, camouflage, the principles of construction of fortified fences, bridges, command posts, and other structures. The future engineers were taught the land, mobile, and other types of mining. The land, for example, conventional mining a field implies emplacing mines in the ground and camouflaging them so they could not be seen. The mobile mining meant emplacing mines quickly within the area where the enemy managed to oust the Soviet troops and to breach the Soviet defense with the tanks. For this kind of mining, in the areas exposed to the tank attacks, they prepared mine depots and vehicularized mobile task forces. At the right moment, these task forces were sent to the place where the enemy tanks had broke through to emplace mines on their way. The students studied the design of the anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. The most common were the pressure mines. This mine, when buried in the ground, was triggered by the direct pressure of its shell or fuse probe. A trip mine is triggered by pulling the wire sensor, and a tension release mine responds to grazing or breaking of a thin wire. The particular attention was paid to the installation of the barbed wire barriers. In some cases, the barbed wire barricades were mined in order to make it more difficult for the enemy to break through them. The students also learned how to install high-tension barriers. Those were 4 meters wide metal grates with the mesh size 25 by 25 centimeters connected to a source of electrical current. Scarps and counter-scarps were the anti-tank barricades which looked like the edge of a slope or the bank of a river, artificially cut at a right angle. The soil excavated while digging the scarp was thrown on the edge of the platform, downward to the slope, and used to form a breastwork in front of the scarp platform. The effect of the scarp is that the enemy tank, having climbed up the slope and having crossed the breastworks, finds itself on the platform with the earthen wall in front of it, which it cannot pass and which interferes with the gunfire. To break through the escarpment, the enemy needed the help of the engineers, who emplaced the explosives and undermined the wall, and high-tension barriers were arranged to hinder the enemy sappers' actions. Among the special high-tension barriers, there were the ground barriers. The sappers dug out a small ditch, at least 1 step wide, the bottom and sides of which were lined with insulation material. Then they emplaced there a bare wire connected to a power source. Then the ditch was covered with soil and camouflaged with turf. The enemy soldiers stepped on the turf and received a strong electric shock. The future engineers were taught the smarts proven by war experience, in particular how to construct the stone fougasses. One had to dig a sloping hollow in the ground. The field charge, fougasse, was emplaced inside the hollow and covered with a thick plank. All of this was filled and covered with field stones and crushed stones. When the enemy infantry approached this mine, the sapper set off the charge. The stones were scattered by the explosion and hit everyone who happened to be close to it. Another engineering trick was the so-called mine roadblock, several mines tied by cables or fixed on a board. The miners, hiding in the shelter, could pull the cables and move these bundles of mines directly under the tracks of the enemy tanks at the right moment. The effectiveness of this method was quite high, and during the war, not only the Soviet troops, but also the German sappers started using the mine roadblocks widely. Once the front stopped, the engineers immediately started mining the approaches to the positions of their troops. Mining, as opposed to demining, was always done from the outside. While laying the mines, the sappers were always moving backwards to their own positions. The sappers went in pairs. The pairs walked at a distance of 50 meters from each other. In order to avoid the habituation and the consequent blunting of attention and vigilance, the miner performed a different operation each day. One day, one sapper would dig hollows for the mines and camouflage them, and his mate inserted the fuses, and the next day they changed the roles. Lev Sverdlov recollects. Mining was not immediately allowed to the novices in the sapper units. First, they had to carry TNT sacks with fuses under long and thorough observation, and only then, after a careful, thorough checkup of what they had learned, they were admitted to the mines.
The
most dangerous sapper's job was certainly the mine clearance. We often had to do it during the battle under the fire. The sappers made the attacks together with the tanks and infantry. Vladimir Ryabushko recalls, "We were seated on the tanks together with the infantry. There were grab handles all over the tank. We tied ourselves to them with anything we could find. Someone tied himself up with a rope. Another one used a cable just to not fall down while driving. When during the advance of the troops, the leading tank was blown up by a mine, all the movement stopped. This meant that there was a minefield straight ahead. The Germans usually started firing. The Soviet tanks opened fire in return. Meanwhile, the sappers jumped down from the tanks and dispersed into a 20-meter wide chain. The flankmen flagged the borders of the pass. The sappers were moving forward on their bellies, in echelon, so that if one sapper was blown up by a mine, the others were not touched by the shrapnel. The mines were located with the help of a probe, a rod or a pin with a sharpened end. The sappers were also equipped with electrical mine detectors that sent the signal into the headphones when metal objects were detected under the ground. But the sappers did not use them in the battle. The battle noise interfered with the signal. Besides, there was metal everywhere on the ground even without mines. In addition, the Germans often used non-metallic mines. There were mines, the shells of which were made of wood, concrete, and thick glass. If a piece of such a mine penetrated into the human body, it was extremely difficult to extract it. Usually the mines were emplaced not very deeply, at the depth of 8 to 10 centimeters. With some mines, deactivation was impossible because they had been emplaced by the Germans in the non-deactivation mode. For example, the only way to neutralize them was to blow them up. Those mines the sappers managed to disarm by unscrewing the fuse were extracted from the ground and thrown beyond the flags that indicated the pass. During the Second World War, the German designers created many various models of mines. Each model had its own characteristics and required special skills for demining. Thus, for example, the TM35 mine could not only have the upper pressure detonator, but also the side and the base detonation fuses that were triggered when somebody tried to extract the mine from the ground. Lev Sverdlov recalls, "We often found the time bombs. The Germans buried the anti-tank mines on the road a little deeper than usual and covered them with 3 to 4 centimeters thick log slices. This trap was covered with the ground. When the sapper was checking the path with the probe came across the piece of wood and the minesweepers moved on, being confident that this place was cleared. But driving along the road, the vehicles would gradually press the wooden slice deeper into the ground, and when the next tank or car pressed down the ground over the mine with all its weight, the mine would detonate. This could happen after a week of continuous movement on the road." As for the anti-personnel mines, the most dangerous one was the spring mine, Sprengmine. It was a metallic glass with the expelling powder charge. Inside, in the center, there was another glass with the blasting agent. Between this glass and the shell of the mine, about 300 steel balls were located. When grazed, the expelling charge tossed the mine at a height of 1.5 meters, where it exploded. The metal balls flew parallel to the ground, hitting everything within a radius of 80 meters. In order to deactivate these mines, the sappers screwed out the under-pressure fuse, tied a cord to the carrying handle, crawled back, and only then pulled the mine out of the ground. In addition to the fields and roads, the Germans often mined the wells, houses, and flats. Lev Sverdlov recalls, "The sappers are a special category of people. A minesweeper will never open the door to the house mechanically in the village that has just been taken. First, he needs to examine and sniff everything, and only then he will decide whether to open the door. And even if he decides to do it, he will tie a piece of wire to it and jerk it. In the towns and villages, the sappers had to examine and check everything before writing their famous phrase, "Checked, no mines," on the house wall. The troops of the 3rd Belarusian Front had directly approached the line of the Königsberg forts by the end of January of 1945. There, they started the systematic preparation which lasted until early April. The engineering reconnaissance was carried out by all the available means: the systematic observations, searches, interrogating the prisoners, studying the captured documents, comparing, checking, and double-checking of all the incoming data. The engineering units were trying to reveal how well the area had been equipped by the enemy. They mapped the discovered German pillboxes, bunkers, trenches, fences, strongpoints. During the reconnaissance activities, the soldiers of the engineering units often crawled at night up to the front line of the enemy defense. Making such a sortie, they crossed the front line of their troops, obeying the strictest control rules. The reserves of the Supreme Command, the assault and engineer sapper brigades, had to become an important tool for strengthening the troops during the storming of Königsberg. They were intended to break through the enemy's strong defensive zones. The Engineer Sapper Brigade consisted of 5 Assault Engineer Sapper Battalions, a K9 company with dogs trained as mine detectors, a battalion of soldiers armed with pack flamethrowers, an engineering tank regiment, and a flamethrower tank regiment. Every assault group sapper was armed with a submachine gun, an army knife, and several anti-tank and anti-personnel grenades. The assault groups had sniper rifles, anti-tank guns, and handheld machine guns. The soldiers were given the new camouflage suits. In addition to helmets, the protective clothing included steel breastplates, protecting from bullets and small splinters, and uncommon for the Soviet infantry. Due to these breastplates, the soldiers were called the armored infantry. The training was composed accordingly. Most of the time was spent on the study of the hand-to-hand fighting and grenade-throwing techniques. 7 days before the operation, certain units from the engineering brigades were included in the assault groups, intended to act in Königsberg. The assault group was consisted of a rifle company, a platoon of heavy machine guns, a platoon of 82mm mortars, 2 to 3 guns, 1 to 2 tanks, or SP guns, a platoon of anti-tank guns, and a unit of flamethrower shooters and chemists. 10 to 12 assault groups were organized in each infantry division. The assault group, in their turn, was subdivided into subgroups and teams. The demolition team was to perform perhaps the main task, to undermine the permanent fire nests, bunkers, and the fortified buildings, which the artillery guns were unable to destroy. The flamethrower team acted together with the demolition team, burning the enemy garrison out of the bunkers and fortified buildings, fencing off the counterattacks of the enemy infantry and tanks, fortifying the captured facilities, and, where it was necessary, burning the fortified buildings. The fortification teams worked on the adaptation of the occupied buildings for the defensive. The support teams, or the ammunition carriers, provided the assault groups with the supplies needed for the combat, the explosives, ammunition, and flame mixture. The thorough preparation for the storming of the city was supposed to save the lives of the soldiers who were to follow the assault groups. In order to enable the Soviet troops to continue the offensive in the west, it was necessary to capture Königsberg and eliminate the German units defending it. The idea of the 3rd Belarusian Front commander, Alexander Vasilevsky, was to defeat the garrison and capture the city by powerful attacks from north and south. Simultaneously, the Soviet troops acted on the offensive against the group of the German troops stationed at the Semlin Peninsula, so that not to let them support Königsberg. Before the storming, the 2 air armies and 2 special bombardment air corps were drawn up close to the city. Particular attention was paid to the heavy artillery. 250 guns per 1 kilometer of the front line, including 8 special battalions of very heavy artillery with 280mm guns, were concentrated against the forts. The narrow-gauge railways were built for the transportation of the ammunition. On the eve of the assault, in the morning of April 5th, the Soviet heavy artillery started shelling the forts, but the walls of the ancient fortresses turned out to be surprisingly strong. Thus, a whole battery of 280mm guns fired at Fort Number 5. More than 70 direct hits at the fort berms were recorded, but out of all of those hits, only 2 shells struck the floor structures of the dungeons. As a result, the preparatory artillery bombardment destroyed only the light guns of the forts. On the night of April 5th and 6th, just a few hours before the storm, the engineers were making passages through the enemy minefields and barricades, clearing the approaches to the forts. On the morning of April 6th, the storming of Königsberg began. The heavy artillery focused the fire on the forts that were located on the way of the main attacks. After the 3-hour artillery barrage, together with the infantry, the heavy self-propelled guns, ready to suppress the return fire from the forts, moved towards them. But the forts were silent. The Soviet tanks and infantry broke through the German defense between the forts and began to move towards the city. By the end of the day, Soviet troops advanced by 3 to 4 kilometers, having cleared a large area from the enemy. The Sappers acted in 3 echelons. The first attack echelon consisted of the military engineers and assault sappers. They moved with the advancing troops and performed the engineering reconnaissance tasks, participated in the assault actions, ensured the passes for the army in the enemy barrages, enabling the military vehicles to break through the barrages and cross the water barriers. They also supported the tanks, fortified the occupied facilities, and covered the outer flanks with the means of engineering control. The engineering units of the 2nd Forward Echelon immediately followed the battle orders and were busy with the route's clearance, clearing of the driveways, and the necessary roads and bridge construction and repair works. The units of the 3rd Rear Echelon performed the control checks of the routes against the possible mining. They constructed the bridges with the capacity of up to 60 tons, fulfilled the special tasks and the clearance of the city. The pioneer assault groups were breaking the way for the advancing troops. The assault group's fighters were armed with submachine guns and handheld machine guns. They had small shovels, wire scissors, assault ladders, and other tools needed to cross the ditches. To enable the tanks and artillery to cross the deep barriers, 10 to 12 meter long temporary panel bridges were prepared, as well as special trestles for the tanks enabling them to cross the anti-tank ditches. There were even ladders prepared in the trenches to make it easier for the soldiers to get out of the trenches during the attack. Having received the signal, the assault group, covered by the artillery and mortar fire, moved forward and approached as close as possible to the assault target, the building or the fort. The assault group sappers brought the explosives close to the building. At the same time, the fire subgroup fired at the attacked building and at the nearest defensive fire nest, not allowing the enemy to fire at the attackers. Smoke screening was applied. The tanks came close to the target along the passages and suppressed the defensive fire nests with their fire, or the tank body simply blocked the embrasures. The personnel of the assault task force made a sudden advance to the attacked target, threw grenades and fired machine guns at the garrison, and then had to break into the stronghold. It was extremely difficult to get inside the target facility. Therefore, the assault group engineers blew up the walls to make passages for the assault subgroup. The flamethrower shooters made fires inside the building, smoking out the enemy garrison, and thus enabling the assault team to get inside. The backpack flamethrowers proved to be an effective tool of the war in the city. In 1942, the Red Army adopted the backpack flamethrower ROKS-3. It consisted of a flame gun, a flexible fuel hose, a propellant tank, a compressed air bottle, a pressure reducer, and a sling. The shooters were also given the special fire-resistant masks. The flame was thrown out due to the compressed air pressure. The air in the air bottle was under pressure of 150 atmospheres. In the reducer, the pressure was reduced down to the working level of 17 atmospheres. Under this pressure, the air was fed into the tank with the flame mixture, and air pressure forced out the flame mixture along the intake pipe and flexible hose to the valve box. When the shooter pressed the trigger, the valve opened and the flame mixture was thrown out through the flame gun. Simultaneously, the firing hammer broke the capsule of the pyro cartridge, which ignited the flame mixture. The flamethrower, ROKS-3, was fueled with the gel flame mixture. The maximum flame-throwing range was about 40 meters. One charging enabled the flamethrower shooter to produce 1 to 2 hang fires or 6 to 8 short bursts. The duration of the shot was controlled by pressing the trigger. When the burning flame mixture fell on a soldier, he at least received severe burns. But more often, enveloped with flames, the man died, because in the battlefield conditions, it was almost impossible to put out the burning clothes soaked with the flame mixture. The flamethrower was not only an effective means to defeat the infantry, but also a strong psychological weapon. When the target building was captured, the sappers faced a new challenge: to prepare it for defense. The enemy tried to recapture the lost buildings and positions and to restore the situation by using the garrisons of the nearest facilities. That's why the sappers tried to prepare the building for defense as quickly as possible and cover the position by mining the approaches to it. But at the same time, it was necessary to continue the assault of the next sites. During the assault, the 51st Special Guards Sapper Battalion of the 13th Guard Rifle Corps particularly distinguished themselves. On April 6th, under the intensive enemy fire, under the command of the Guard Sergeant Nikolai Galabin, the sapper platoon of this battalion made passages through the enemy barricades, having opened the way for the attackers. But the Nazis' permanent firing position would not let the troops advance and attack the fort. Under the heaviest enemy fire, Galabin and his 3 sappers approached the fire nest and blew up its garrison. The way to the fort was open. On April 7th, the commander of another platoon of the same battalion, Lieutenant Alexander Rodotelev, included in the assault group, together with 8 sappers, approached the firing positions of the enemy anti-aircraft batteries. Having made a sudden raid, the sappers captured 15 anti-aircraft guns, killed 6 Nazis in close-in combat, and captured 5 enemy soldiers. A few minutes later, the Germans attempted to return to the abandoned weapons. Self-propelled gunner Dmitry Kiryachik recalls. First, we attacked the 5th fort. At night, a small group of sappers crossed the ditch and got into the fort yard where the mortars were emplaced. The sappers shot the mortarmen and planted explosives here and there. Generally, these forts were taken quickly, as if they had never existed. The sappers repulsed 3 counterattacks and had kept the artillery positions until the main forces approached them. The success of the sappers left an indelible impression on the soldiers of other service arms. For the 2 days of fighting, the Soviet troops had captured 130 blocks in northern and southern parts of the city. 3 of the forts, the artillery plant, the engineering plant, the constructional ironworks, the main railway yard, and the railway workshops. But the Königsberg garrison troops were standing up stubbornly. The German High Command had taken every measure to avoid the isolation of the garrison from the troops stationed on the Samland Peninsula. On April 8th, the commanders of the Soviet armies committed the second echelon to the attack. In the afternoon, the units of the 11th Guards Army, supported by the heavy artillery fire, crossed the Pregel River at northwest from the village of Panart and joined the units of the 43rd Army. The garrison of the fortress was completely cut off and isolated from the forces operating at the Samland Peninsula. The main forces of the Germans, stationed in the city, moved to the center and eastern part of the city. Due to the fighting on April 8th, the Soviet troops completely controlled the Königsberg port and railway junction, as well as a number of important military and industrial facilities, having cleared more than 300 quarters of the Germans and having captured 4 of the forts. By the end of April 8th, the Königsberg enemy garrison was trapped in a small ring. The Germans' fire resistance had considerably declined because of the huge losses. Having retreated to the city center and eastern part, Kaltov, they still continued to struggle. The storming of the main forts lasted for 3 days, but in the morning of April 9th, the Germans' resistance was already of the focal nature. In the evening, the commandant of the Königsberg fortress, General Otto von Lasch, sent the envoys to the command post of one of the Soviet infantry regiments. On the night of April 10th, in the General's Command bunker, the order was signed for the unconditional surrender of the Königsberg city and fortress. Germans' military tribunal sentenced Commandant Otto von Lasch in absentia to death by hanging, with the wording, "For the cowardly city surrender." By 9 a.m., the Germans raised the white flag over their last center of resistance, the Tower of Dana near the upper lake, Oberteich. After the assault orders and medals were awarded to many fighters of the Corps of Engineers, and those who had distinguished themselves most of all received the Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union, Königsberg was the only city which was not the capital of any state, but for carrying of which the special medal was instituted. Igor Pakomov recalls, "We entered Vienna across the river Danube. They started shooting at us. The river bank was 50 meters behind. I started firing with my DSHK machine gun, Degtyarev Shpagin heavy machine gun. I hadn't shot that much for the whole wartime. I don't know if I killed someone or not, but I did not let them raise their heads, that's for sure. The machine gun overheated and became jammed. We broke through to the bridge, landed the troops, and turned back. For these actions, I received my second Order of the Red Banner and the Medal for the Capture of Vienna." At that time, Igor Pakomov was only 14 years old. In mid-April, the Red Army Administrative Commandant, General Krylev, ordered to design the medals for the capture and for the liberation of the foreign cities. The medals for the liberation were awarded to the military men who had liberated the capitals of the friendly states. Those were Prague, Warsaw, and Belgrade. The medals for the capture were awarded to the military men who had stormed Berlin and the capitals of Germany's allies, Hungary and Austria. The only medal for the capture of the city which was not the state capital was the medal for the capture of Königsberg. It should be mentioned that the assault of such cities as Poznan and Breslau was no less hard, but no medals had been instituted for the capture of them. A large group of artists were involved in the work on the medal design. By May 1st, 16 drafts had been considered. The design of the medals was approved in June of 1945. The medal for the capture of Königsberg was awarded to about 760,000 people. The medal for the capture of Budapest was awarded to about 362,000 people. The medal for the capture of Vienna was awarded to 277,380 people. The medal for the liberation of Belgrade was awarded to 70,000 people. The medal for the liberation of Warsaw was awarded to 701,700 people. The medal for the liberation of Prague was awarded to 395,000 people. The medal for the capture of Berlin was awarded to more than 1 million. During the hard battles for Königsberg, the engineering troops proved once again that it is impossible for a modern army to carry out successful operations without them. It remained less than a month to the end of the war. The Soviet troops were marching toward Berlin, and the military engineers were making the bridges to the victory for them. But even after May of 1945, the hard work of the sappers did not stop. The Corps of Engineers were clearing the debris in the urban areas, spanned the rivers, and built new bridges to replace the blown-up ones. But under the ground, in the fields, on the roads, in the villages, and the cities, there still remained thousands of mines. Even decades later, the sappers were killed when demining them. Those were the last victims of the Great Patriotic War.